Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, shall we take a look at another of the reasons Brexiteers give in continuing to support their Leave vote? This time, it's democracy. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So, in light of the recent focus on people evaluating their Leave and Remain votes from 2016, we had the anniversary of the referendum last week, some Brexiteers have been trying to pretend that their Leave vote worked out well for one reason or another. One of them cropped up at the weekend from Professor Matt Goodwin, someone who was once of some renown until he fell down a rabbit hole. But he said that one of the improvements to his life that Brexit had brought was living in a genuine democracy. Now, this is the same Professor Goodwin who has been plugging his latest book for weeks, in which he argues that the country is in the undemocratic grip of the new elite of Remainers and blobs. Or actually, maybe one blob. I'm not sure it's one blob or multiple blobs. But Remainers and one or more blobs. So he's sort of contradicting himself immediately. He argues that he lives in a genuine democracy in a Brexit defending tweet, yet argues the opposite in his book as well as the bulk of his tweets. But nobody ever accused Brexiteers of consistency. But regardless of his own particular contortions, shall we look at the general argument about democracy? So, when we voted to leave the EU, we did so as part of a democratic process. Yes, several groups broke the law, as confirmed by the High Court, but the process itself was democratic, even if we didn't run it democratically. We didn't fight for our exit, as so many post-colonial countries have had to, where there was no democratic process. Despite Brexiteers talking about having to fight for our independence, they did no such thing. Nor would they have, because they're all spineless cowards. If the UK faced actual invasion, you wouldn't see these people for the sea spray as they sped off to the safer shores of America with their millions in tow. No, there was no fighting. They had their say, they put their tick in a box. All part of a democratic process which was laid out by the EU. In fact, when you consider that the EU has a very clear, very specific democratic provision for members to leave the Union, and the UK does not for its member nations, people are often quick to point out one way in which the EU is more democratic than the UK immediately. Another facet is that the EU Commission and EU Parliament are mostly responsible for the bulk of decisions and EU rules. 100% of all members of both bodies are elected. 100% of them. Now compare with the UK, where fewer than half of all parliamentarians in Westminster are elected. The majority of them are not elected. They don't stand for election at all. The government's also not elected. People think it is because they're mostly MPs, but two things to consider. First, not all members of the government are MPs. Some of them are unelected members of the House of Lords. David Frost was a very famous example of an unelected bureaucrat cabinet minister with a great deal of power, and he was given taxpayer-funded budgets to spend at his discretion, having never been given office by the people. But he was by no means the only example. Second, even when the MPs are not elected, even when the government minister is an MP, they're not elected members of the government. They're elected members of the House of Commons. That is it. They're elected to be that constituency's representative in Parliament. The country doesn't get to elect its Chancellor or Home Secretary or Defence Secretary or even Prime Minister. If we did, we would inevitably end up with a cross-party government, which would actually sound nice to some but be a logistical nightmare. But the point is that no member of our government is elected to their office. You will not be able to point at a single vote. It is true that when most people vote in the general election, they are doing so with the aim of making a specific person the Prime Minister. But that's not what their vote actually means. After all, in my lifetime, the country has had 7 people become Prime Minister without a general election. Only 3 of them became Prime Minister after an election. So 70% of all Prime Ministers in my lifetime, or that have become Prime Ministers in my lifetime, have done so without a general election. So even if you think you're voting for a Prime Minister, it doesn't mean the winner will even stay Prime Minister until the next election. So you're not. Also, the other government positions change around quite frequently. Never any consultation with the public. So again, no argument. The EU is more democratic than the UK. The next factor to consider is representation. Now, the European Parliament elects its MEPs by a process of proportional representation. This means that the various groups and parties are represented much more closely in proportion to their popular support than in Westminster, where first past the post is used. Now, that doesn't automatically make the EU more democratic because it's the same number of people having a vote. I mean, democracy is about people having a vote. It's got nothing really to do with how well that vote can be used. But it is more representative, which is as good as being more democratic for some people. But there is certainly no way of arguing that the UK system is more democratic than the EU system. When we were EU members, British voters had way more agency over their representation in the EU Parliament than they did in the Westminster Parliament or any other British Parliament. And yes, it meant that we ended up with UKIP members because enough voters wanted that. But that is the nature of being more representative. Another democratic benefit of the EU is that it cannot be controlled by a single narrow interest group. This is not just because of proportional representation, but because there's no leader. There's a president of the EU Commission, but they don't tell MEPs in the Parliament which way to vote. There is a president of the EU Parliament. They don't either. There is also a president of the EU Council, and guess what? They don't tell anyone how to vote either. There is no one person in the EU who can put forward legislation and basically guarantee to have it passed without having worked on a consensus with others first. In fact, it's impossible for any group in the EU to get something passed against the will of the rest. There is simply no EU equivalent of the Conservatives passing legislation when every other party is against it. Can't happen. The fact of the matter is that the EU is much more democratic than the UK, or indeed any of its other member states, out of sheer necessity. Now, if Brexiteers would like to argue that it's too much democracy, oh, we don't like the democracy, okay, they can do that. But they cannot argue that we enhanced democracy by leaving, because what we actually did was give more power over our affairs to people we did not elect. And we did this in two principal ways. First, in the direct sense, our government are not elected. Some members of our government are not elected at all to any position because they came via the House of Lords. And how did they get into that? Like David Frost, for example, when he became a cabinet minister, he wasn't in the House of Lords. Boris Johnson put him in the House of Lords so that he could then put him in his cabinet. So Boris Johnson just picked a member of the public and said, I want you in my cabinet. These unelected ministers existed when we were in the EU, of course, but they now decide more things. So we have increased the number of decisions made for us by people that we did not elect and no one elected. But there's also the indirect loss of democracy because we still follow EU rules, all of them. We have to if we want to trade, and we do want to trade. Of course, it was always the case that we would follow Japan's rules for exporting to Japan and America's rules for exporting to America and so on. And we never had any democratic say in those rules. We followed them because we wanted to trade. But we used to be one of the main decision makers in the EU. 98% of all EU rules as they existed in 2016 were either devised by or supported by the UK Parliament of the time. So we used to have direct democratic oversight over the rules we followed when exporting to other members of the single market. And we had representation in the Council, in the Commission and in the Parliament. We've now lost all of that. We no longer have any representation in any of those bodies, but we are still following the rules. Not that anyone has ever objected to any of the rules, by the way. Plenty of Brexiteers object to the rules collectively, but are strangely silent when you ask them for a specific rule which they object to. The odd one, like Boris Johnson, will attempt it, but they don't exist. Because bananas were always bendy. We were always allowed prawn cocktail crisps. And you know what? We could always have a crown mark on a pint glass if we wanted to. Not that the post-Brexit ones have anyway. So no, we don't live in a genuine democracy. We actually have less democracy. Still, this can be changed. We don't need to join the EU to become more democratic. We can sort many of the issues out ourselves independently, starting with the House of Lords and giving the votes to more tax-paying members of the public, going on to a more federal model of regional devolution, and passing through more modern voting systems as well. And when we are more democratic, I hardly think that we will democratically support being poorer because a few billionaires told us we'd be happier that way. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for membership. And until next time, I'll see you later.